All right, so here we are. The false identification of what we're going to do this morning is our space future, a 5-year moon and Mars strategy. We're not going to do 5 years. We're going to do 10, and K-12 space education. So we have, I know, some educators in the room. I recognize at least 2 of you. And that's what we're going to focus on primarily, is, how do we raise a new generation of space enthusiasts and orient them correctly in the 6 axes that are relevant. And we have a remarkable panel for you, half a dozen, and you're going to dig it. Rod Pyle is the editor-in-chief of This Rag. There are copies of it up here. Get them before they run out. And basically, Rod's superpower is he knows everybody in the space business, which is a great thing.
Yeah.
Next to him, that handsome fellow with the thin tie is the head of the Columbia. Remember Columbia? It's the second one that poofed. Memorial Science Center. And Ben Dickau is a STEM educator. And he's well primed both to talk to us about stuff and to enlist us in doing his good works. Negin Cox. I would love to have this kind of a title before I die. It's not going to happen, though. Tactical Mission Lead, Curiosity Rover Flight Team. Cool, right? Very cool. And Susan, right next to her, Susan Carlin is a late add to this, and we're so glad to have her because she's a serious journalist. Not that I and my colleague Rod are not. We're semi-serious journalists. But Susan's a serious. She writes for magazines you got to actually know stuff to get published in, like IEEE Spectrum. And
Wired.
And
Fast Company.
Right. Yeah. Fast Company, real stuff. So she'll keep us semi-honest, but I'm here too. Another rule, by the way, that's going to be different, and why you're going to remember this panel amongst all the forgettable panelists, and there are many at our show, is we're going to have the microphones live. So we're actually going to yell at each other. It's going to be great. This is going to be different, right? Last guy down, that handsome dude, Dennis Young, also a late ad. He's from JPL. And he's the only one of all of us who's a real business person, besides his many other accomplishments, which he'll tell you about briefly. He was in the Navy, lived in 35 countries, and lived on 3 continents, and studied Spanish and all this stuff. He born in Peru or raised in Peru?
Raised in Peru.
Dang, man, in the Hidden Valley. The dude is actually one of the actuarial type folks who green lights or ungreen lights little things like Curiosity Rover. I'm sorry, but we just don't have the money for that. That comes out of his lips. So he'll keep us honest as well. And he's also one of these STEM crazies. He's talked to 10,000 kids in his time. 10,000. I've warped the minds of at least 10,000 kids, but not as purposefully as we're about to do this morning. So here's what we're going to do. Everybody's going to get 90 seconds to introduce themselves. Then we're going to do 2 minutes of your vision for 10 years, space exploration, not just US, but anything you want to talk about. Then we're going to argue about K-12, enlistment of a new generation of space enthusiasts, and then we'll open it to you, and it'll be fun. Who are you?
Rod Pyle, last I checked.
90 seconds. You have
okay.
88 seconds. Don't waste it.
Okay. Good morning, educators and others. Thank you for having us here. I'm old, as you can see, so I was born just before NASA was. So I was fortunate to have grown up during the Apollo era, which made me a bit of a space fanatic. While my friends were outside doing sports and revering football players, I was inside watching moonwalks, at least the part that the networks would show us before they cut off to reruns of I Love Lucy. So it was a really exciting time to be alive, and I've spent the rest of my career trying to communicate that to the broadest possible audience, but including young people. So as Marty mentioned, I edit this magazine called Ad Astra for the National Space Society. If you're not a member, you should be. It's really inexpensive for the first year. We've got a bunch of copies up here. And I've written 17 books, the most recent of which was Space 2.0 commercial.
Great.
Okay,
Thanks for that. No, that's great.
Yeah, okay, no problem. It's the only handbook for new space so far. I know there are others coming, but so far this is it. Good for junior high and up. So that's enough of that. So in addition to my work on the magazine, and as a writer, I've also worked in visual effects for Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica, and worked in documentaries for a number of years for the History Channel until we started doing things like Bayou Billionaires, and then I just had to leave. And that's when I got into book writing. So that's it for me. Great.
Ben.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Dicko. I'm the president and executive director of the Columbia Memorial Space Center. We're a space museum and hands-on science learning center located in Downey, California, on the former NASA facility that built all the Apollo spacecraft that you watched, and all the space shuttles, plus a bunch of other stuff. Our mission is to ignite a community of creative and critical thinkers. We feel that science, or STEM, really is the human ability to creative and critically think, and our job is to make sure that everybody, all communities everywhere, have access to that and enthusiasm for it. We do all kinds of things, outreach programs, events, exhibits, just like any sort of standard space museum or science museum. Two of our premier things, we coordinate LA Science Festival called the City of STEM. It happens the entire month of April. We do a big launch the first Saturday of the month, and usually see about 10,000 people in that one day. This year, or 2020, it'll be April 4th. We have about 130 different STEM organizations around town coming together to do STEM activities every single day of the month of April, and it's been endorsed by the mayor of LA and the National Science Festival Alliance and all that kind of stuff. We also are expanding the Space Center. We have the 1-to-1 scale mock-up of the space shuttle. So we're going to build a new home for that in the next few years. But actually, that's just an object. What this building is all about, seeing our mission kind of be in a space so that we can really serve all people in Southern California and get them enthusiastic about STEM.
Dynamite, wonderful. Nikki.
Good morning. My name is Nikki Cox. I'm an engineer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but today I'm here kind of speaking for myself, and especially when we start arguing and interrupting each other. Those are definitely my opinions. So I've wanted to work at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory since I was 14. JPL is responsible for the robotic exploration of the solar system. So before we send people, we send robots. And because it's the robots that go first, that is why I was very drawn to JPL. I was actually born in India and grew up in the center of the United States in Kansas City. And that's where I decided this is what I want to do. I want to be a part of something that brings people together. Given my situation, there was not a lot of money in my family for the girls to go to college, so I was lucky to get an Air Force scholarship, and went to Cornell University, got a degree in engineering and a degree in psychology. Sometimes it's not clear to me which one I use more. And then got some space operations background in the Air Force that allowed me to join JPL, and I've actually been there for 20 years now and have worked on Mars exploration missions, Jupiter exploration, extrasolar, and the thing that is amazing to me is after being there for 2 decades, it feels like every day is still as much fun as the first, and that is attributable to the teams that it takes to put these complicated missions on other projects. So I feel very privileged to work at JPL and also to be here today.
Wonderful. Susan.
Hi, I'm Sue Carlin, and I write about the nexus of science, technology, and arts primarily for Fast Company magazine, but I've also written for IEEE Spectrum, New York Times, Scientific American, Discover, Newsweek, Forbes, places like that. And I've traveled to every continent. I've reported from almost every continent. I have gotten sick on every continent. And my science background is I'm a recovering pre-med, but I never lost my love for science when I fell in love with journalism. And so I've always, wherever my journalism career has taken me, it's always kind of come back to various aspects of science, whether it's engineering or medicine or more recently space, because now space is hot. And I just got my next article coming up in this arena is I just came back from diving with some astronauts off the Florida Keys. I'm doing a story on the Aquarius Research Base and the Coral Restoration Foundation, which are connected. And so, what is that? Is that
that's the guy who runs the show. That's Victor.
What?
Victor runs the show.
The boss.
Oh, okay. Which show? This show?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So apparently we have to be really nice to you.
I didn't
So-
give her a pass. She talked her way in. That's-
No, I have a pass now. So that's my next article coming up, and I think for this panel, I may talk a little bit about some of the STEM stuff going on at Burning Man.
Ooh, good.
Yeah, so I'll tease that.
Okay, could you raise your hand if you've been on all the continents, please? Check it out. Check it out. Okay.
Almost.
Yeah.
Almost.
About to say.
Yeah.
Just need Africa.
We get around.
How many have you got?
I have 6 of the,
You have 6?
5 of the inhabited continents. I've seen Africa, but I haven't set foot on Africa.
But you've been to Antarctica?
No, the inhabited. I don't.
Oh, I got you. Okay,
count
he gets 5. That's it.
Nagi's the cool one.
Antarctica.
All right, great. Dennis, who are you?
So I am Dennis Young. I'm with JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and quick disclaimer, just like Nagi, my opinions are my own. They do not represent the Caltech, JPL, or NASA. So now that that is out of the way, everything that was said about me before, but I got to say that I got into outreach, STEM outreach, because I have 2 kids, and I showed up one day with a Mars rover to my kids' school because my son told me, I want to be a firefighter, I want to be a cop, because somebody else's dad came for come to work day kind of thing. And I said, oh, I can top that. And he's like, no, you can't. I'm like, oh, you just watch
you
this.
watch this.
I brought a Mars rover to his school, and the police officer dad wanted to drive the rover, and I'm like, sorry, man, only the cool people get to do this.
The kids.
And then I had a daughter. And I got to say, I echo much of what Nagi said about the pride of being able to work in something that's bigger than myself at JPL and work with amazing people like Nagi. But my greatest accomplishment has not been STEM-oriented at all. It's been a thing that I started for my daughter called Women in STEM. And I started to notice very subtle things. People would go up to my son and say, oh, your dad works at JPL. Are you going to be an engineer? You're such a smart boy. And they go up to my daughter and they'd say, what a pretty girl. I'm like, she's smart too, And I just think that if the world got to see the amazing women that I work with, like Nagi, I think we could change the perception of women in STEM. And it's not the Amy Fowlers on The Big Bang Theory. Great TV show, very funny, very entertaining. But it's not what you see. That's not the reality. And I would like to help steer that reality. And so we have presented to several thousand high school girls throughout the Los Angeles area, bringing up to 3,000 pounds of NASA equipment, up to 20 speakers like Nagi, and they get to rub shoulders, these high school girls get to rub shoulders with real women, not astronauts, but rocket scientists. And what an amazing experience. So thank you for the privilege of speaking with you here.
Bless you. What a panel. And give it to him. Come on, give him the love. This is, by the way, this is Victor, largely. And in this case, I also have to compliment Rod, for assembling this remarkable collection of people. I'm really grateful to have you. Okay, now, in little 2 to 3 minute bites, let's talk about the future, the coming decade. Let's summarize space, though. We have 60 years, right, roughly, since 1957, Sputnik, right? 62 years in orbit. In the 60s, it was, for the US, basically these were military rockets that were used. The Atlas was a military rocket, and the Titan was a military rocket. And so were the earlier funky things, the Pioneer and whatnot, were launched on, naval rockets. And in the 70s, we moved from heavy launch vehicles from anybody been to Houston or to Florida, to Kennedy, Canaveral? Go there sometime. And what they've got is they got the whole Apollo unit. And it takes you about a minute and a half to walk from one end to the other. It's longer than a football field.
363 feet.
Very good.
It's a monster.
Only 13 of which came home.
Right. Yeah, dig it. And so we ended that sort of basically German-derived Wernher von Braun, heavy lift stuff, and we looked forward to reducing the cost of space launches, and the shuttle came in the 70s, right? And then we blew one up in the early 80s, and then we blew up another one later in the 80s. And the cost benefits of the shuttle were never fully demonstrated. And the shuttle was so one shot, as it were, pony. And then we went into sort of a dark era where the robotic stuff was extraordinary, and it was extraplanetary, it was beyond the range of the first planet. But people's interest, grown-up people's interest, flagged, and I suspect kids' interest somewhat flagged, because this wasn't an emergent, clear, dramatic goal that we had. We weren't going to the moon or even Mars. We were just, looking around and probing planets and getting incredible information. Not just probing planets. They stick things into the ground on planets and do chemical tests and report the stuff back. Meanwhile, we're getting information from rockets that were launched 20, 25 years before, still gathering the data. But it was I would describe it as a dim time, the 90s for government-sponsored space exploration. Then comes space industrialization. Then comes SpaceX, and soon Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactica, and all the various, gleams in the eye of billionaires who want to claim a chunk, not only of NASA's money, but of other stuff. And now we're in a Space 2.0 situation, as Rod describes it. We're in another generation. And indeed, there's another generation of kids that we would like to mobilize for a variety of reasons. One, to support the policies that fund NASA. Two, to become the scientists and engineers who will enable us to do truly remarkable stuff in the future. And three, to, go boldly where few have gone before. It's time for a new generation of space. So we're going to talk, each of us, a couple of minutes on our vision for 10 years out. It could be US, it could not be US, it could be China. What do you see? 10 years in space.
Shall I start? Okay.
Yeah, from now to 2030.
So perfect question, because that's 5 years ago when I started working on the Space 2.0 book. That was my question. I had my opinions, but who am I? I'm a journalist. I'm a writer. Nobody wants to hear my opinion. So I went to 42 leaders in the field. So top officials that oversee space agencies, top people at NASA, top people at SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, some of the smaller companies, Made in Space, investment firms, critically, a multi-billionaire named Steve Jurvetson, who basically saved SpaceX in 2008, and a whole lot of technical people, and said, what do you see in the next 10 to 20 years? And the answers were fairly consistent, I have to say. And the sort of core message that came out of this, just to back up a step, a lot of people, I talk to a lot of groups of young people, and the question comes up a lot, why haven't we been back to the moon? When are we going to have another Apollo? When are we going to have a president stride up to the podium and say, the moon in our era, And the answer is we probably won't. We kind of saw this with Artemis, the proposed return to the moon, first woman on the moon by 2024. That's already slipping. It's only been a couple of years. So this will be the fourth time that NASA's initiated an effort to get humans back into deep space, the moon potentially beyond. And we'll make it, but it probably will be closer to 2028. That's just my opinion. The reason is Apollo was a geopolitical program. You'll hear a lot of people say, oh, the nation was united behind this great effort and so forth, and that's just not the case. If you look at the polling from that era, and it's about the same now, depending on what questions you ask, public support's about 50-50, and it still is. So the good news is we have as much support now for space exploration as Apollo did. The bad news is we don't have a good enemy in the Soviet Union, which is what made that work. And the moon was very tough, but we really picked the low-hanging fruit of the solar system in terms of human exploration in that era from 1961 to 1972. Shuttle, as Marty mentioned, was a whole different deal. The plan was to fly this thing, hose it off, fuel it up, clean out the ashtrays and set it up again, and it never quite reached that potential. It was a bridge too far. In terms of what's coming up, of course, the big destabilizer here is the Billionaires Boys Club. These guys grew up either during or just after the Apollo era, were very inspired by it, as I was, but they have a lot of money that they made from the internet for the most part, and they said, we're going to start our own little space program, and they're doing it. Jeff Bezos puts $1 billion of his own money, with a B, every year into his space company, into his hobby, and at the rate he's going, he can only do that for about another 156 years, I think. So he's got a good handle on this. Faster moving is SpaceX. Elon Musk is a brilliant, brilliant guy. Not necessarily a role model for a lot of us because he's kind of one of those people that may have come from another planet, we're not sure. But a brilliant engineer, a brilliant marketing mind. So in the US, the corporate sector, the commercial sector is really going to drive this, and hopefully NASA will join with them in increasing form, and that's what we think we see happening. In terms of the big picture for Space 2.0, I just got back from China, which if there's going to be another Soviet Union in the next 20 years, it'll probably be China, at least from our perspective. And there's a lot of motivation there to do this. And they plan 10 years out. They have a president for life. They make decisions. They commit funds. And they do what they say they're going to do. And they're drawing on a lot of our engineering and the Soviet engineering expertise from the 60s. But they're making it much better, and they're doing brilliant things. In a perfect world, I think the hope for Space 2.0, and I wish I had my Venn diagram behind me. It's the only one I use, and I do PowerPoint. Which is, one circle at the top has NASA, which is still a premier space agency in the world, and JPL is a huge part of that. You know, when you see a tenth of the money going to JPL, but, and I'm being a little loose with my facts here, maybe 30-40% of what's happening at NASA that's newsworthy for the public coming out of JPL, it's remarkable. And by the way, they win Emmys for their social media. That's a big deal. So you got NASA up at the top. You got other international space agencies over in another circle. So that includes Europe, China, India, you know, these emerging powers that are becoming quite active. And then over in the final circle, you've got
The Boys Club.
commercial. Yeah, the Billionaires Boys Club. And that includes a lot of small companies. I mean, there's probably at this point 80 companies trying to get small rockets built. That market's saturated. You're going to see a die-off there. But obviously SpaceX, Blue Origin, and those folks aren't going anywhere. Where these overlap, especially in the international sector, and Buzz Aldrin talks about this all the time, and he's right. If you can get international cooperation going and then bring in the best business entities, including ones from overseas, which we're increasingly seeing in China, Israel, and India, now you've really got something. You've got a cooperative effort moving ahead, basically unlimited funds and incredible amounts of intellectual capital. The other common element here, that's my fantasy, of course, the other common element here is young people. This is when I was growing up, you either worked for NASA or defense, and that was it. Those are the two things America did really well in terms of space exploration, was building rockets that could take nuclear bombs to the enemy, and building rockets that could put people on the moon and bring them home, and building spacecraft that could go out and reconnoiter the planets. That's not true anymore. When I go to classrooms, or if I go to hackathons, which NASA often sponsors, and they do a really good job of it, or if I go to universities, I see kids of all backgrounds from many nations. I do a conference every year with the National Space Society called the International Space Development Conference. Out of 1,300 attendees, 600 are kids, most of them from India and Eastern Europe. I don't get the Eastern Europe connection, it just happened. India, I understand, a few from other parts of Asia, very few from the United States, which I find disturbing. But the good message for kids is there's opportunities for everybody of every stripe, every background, every economic level. There are kids building CubeSats at home that they're going to launch on rockets. The first launch of the Space Launch System is going to have a big billet for this. So I've talked enough. Suffice it to say, the future of new space as I see it, or Space 2.0 if you will, is private industry. Is NASA increasingly working with private industry to do a lot more for a lot less money, a tenth in some studies, their own studies, and internationalism.
Well said. Great.
Well, thanks for the question, but I'm going to completely divest myself from the answer. This panel knows a lot more and can prognosticate what's going to happen in 10 years a little bit better. But to me, I think, from my perspective, it's all about sort of participation. I'd like to see the space program in 10 years be much more representative of everybody in the United States, and then obviously then international. And sort of backing out from that goal, it's how do we get to that point? And it's, I would like to, somebody on the panel said that space was hot right now. It's true, but it's also, yeah, but it's also, well, two things. One, I don't want it to burn out in 10 years. So it's figuring out a way to maintain that momentum and that cachet was very important, and I think a strategic goal for all of us in the STEM education field. But it's also you want, it can't just be sort of a flash in the pan time-wise and also depth-wise. I think it needs to be reinventing how we do STEM education in the United States and internationally is vitally important, and that should go hand in hand with the space program going out 10 years in the future. We still work under a very old model. The public education system definitely works under a very old model of how you do STEM education. The Space Center and people in my sector were out of school time, where most of the kids spend most of their time and all their entire life. So how do we really plus up that sector and make it just as legit and rich as the school? It's a great way to overcome the barriers of access and equity and things like that are inherent in all of this stuff, and to get to the goal of full participation. The other thing that I'd like to see, kind of, again, paralleling with this and kind of backing out a little further, is I'd like to see that Billionaires Boys Club support the Space Center and other art and places like this. I think that there's, I'm as CEO of a museum, I've tried to fundraise constantly, it seems like, and it's, the support we get and the partnerships we build and all that stuff, I'm not knocking it at all, but I definitely think that it could be better. I don't think that it's just a commodification of education also. I don't think it's just about like, hey kid, we've got this program from XYZ space company and this is going to guarantee you a job into engineering. That's not what this should be about. I think at its essence, all of this stuff should be about building better people, whether they're better lawyers or whatever. I think STEM is inherently fantastic and awesome as an endeavor, just as being a human being. But there is this ancillary sort of effect that you might get a better educated, whatever. So I think, making the case to those billionaires that this is something that needs to be supported is vitally important. And hopefully I would like to see that happen in 10 years, or maybe in a couple of years.
How about 10 minutes? Let's
I'm about to start a capital campaign and a multi-million-dollar expansion of the Space Center, so maybe in the next year.
Yeah, amen. Seriously, it's a righteous thing. Nagin.
Okay, so how should I answer this question? So first I'll just talk about, because he said he wanted us to be lively and give our opinion, so I'm going to give my opinion. So first off, let me just answer that, what I think 10 years from now, I agree very much with Rod, that it is going to be a triumvirate of the commercial space companies, the international agencies, as well as, NASA being a part of those international agencies. China obviously has the aspect that they don't have to have 100% support of their population to say, I'm going to do something, or the country's going to do something. If they decide they're going to go to the moon, if they decide they're going to go to Mars, they have the range in their planning of saying, this is going to take 10 years and we can do that. Whereas we have the 4-year horizon of our administrations that we need to keep going through and doing what we hope we're going to do. Right now, NASA's going through kind of the return to moon, go to Mars, and the shifting that has happened there. So it's good that we're now kind of saying, okay, the technology to do both of those is similar. So whether or not, whichever way the country and the taxpayers want to go, let's keep going on getting ready for this. So we will see in the goals of the human exploration or the Artemis program to go to the moon in a way that we stay, as well as getting ready for sending humans to Mars. But that's not what I want to talk about. So you heard over here, Space 1.0 and 1.0 and Space 2.0, and that the 90s were dim. No, they weren't. Robotic space exploration has been going on this whole time. So yes, human exploration is what people are aware of, but the 90s is when we sent Galileo, my first mission, the first mission to go into orbit around a gas giant. Yes, JPL has part of NASA's budget, and I don't necessarily agree that 30 to 40% of the headlines are JPL. I think the number is much higher in terms of what JPL is able to. Remember, opinions are my own, right? In terms of what the robotic exploration that we've been able to do. Part of the reason that I wanted to work at JPL was because at the time, that was one of the only games in town for robotic space exploration. That and Lockheed Martin and our partners who put the first missions in the 60s and 70s that opened up the solar system to robotic exploration. Now, there are universities, other space agency, other labs in the United States, like the Applied Physics Lab. There are so many different places that robotic exploration is being done. And in fact, something that, let's see, when is it? So something we did, JPL did last year with the InSight landing was sending a CubeSat called Marco, and it was the first interplanetary CubeSat. When I was just talking about this with someone last night, when we look at the next 10 years, I believe that we will see a very big difference in the way robotic space, or an opening up of the way robotic space exploration is done, because now that universities see that you can actually potentially do science with a CubeSat. I think you'll see a lot more space science objectives being accomplished by universities and other institutions that say, hey, I don't need the overhead of NASA or a space agency to do this. I can, at my university, have everything in-house and say, we're going to build a CubeSat, launch it, and it'll achieve this objective that my professor of planetary science wants to do. So I think CubeSats will be a huge part of what we see in the next 10 years. We are also expecting to, hopefully one of the missions I'm working on now, the Mars 2020 rover, will be going to Mars, launching next year, so that's coming up soon, and we'll be collecting samples that we are preparing to return to the Earth. Mars sample return which is slated for the next 10 years, is actually going to try to bring back robotic samples from Mars robotically. The astronauts did that with the moon, and but have human go pick up rock, bring it back, right? Trying to do that robotically is extremely challenging technically. And when Rod was talking about his Venn diagram and the importance of the hope that there will be international collaboration, that's another case of where it's happening now. On these robotic missions, we have instruments that come from other countries, and we put instruments on the robotic spacecraft that other countries send. So there is, as the spacefaring community grows next year, the Middle East will launch their first mission to Mars called HOPE, and that's out of Dubai and the UAE. So more and more countries are getting involved, and we are learning how to collaborate already. That exists in the missions we do now. Clearly collaborating on human exploration is what everyone wants to see, and it's what kind of is the most visible face of the space program. But I hope that as we talk about what happens in the next 10 years, that there is this steady drumbeat of exploration that is done by the robots, right? So that we can prepare for sending humans. That was the reason that I didn't want to be an astronaut. When I was growing up, the astronauts were and are stuck in Earth orbit. And now kids growing up can see that they're, if we return to one of the really great things about, going back to the moon and Mars besides the scientific and engineering exploration, is that students and kids will then see that they're, maybe they will want to be astronauts because the astronauts are actually going somewhere. And so I want to point out the amount that's happening now to prepare for human exploration. The rovers are, the Mars rovers, which has been a lot of my work in the last years. Not only are we exploring Mars to find out what Mars used to be like, but we're also gathering information that we need for human exploration. The Curiosity rover is the first one that has returned radiation data from Mars. We need that information before we can even build spacesuits. The next mission in 2020, for those of you who saw the movie The Martian, we're actually flying a prototype of the oxygenator called MOXIE. And that's something that will pull apart the Martian atmosphere into the CO2 atmosphere into carbon monoxide and oxygen, so that we can start the process of learning how to make oxygen on Mars robotically, so that when the astronauts get there and while they're there, we'll be able to provide them with the resources. So human exploration and robotic exploration go together, and we will just continue to see that for the next 10 years. We definitely, and just to finish up, yes, the international cooperation that the robotic missions are seeding now, we hope will go into the human exploration part, and the commercial space companies. JPL is down the street. Well, yeah, as you know, LA wise, from SpaceX. And we trade people. I have people that I work with who worked at SpaceX and are now at JPL, and people who've gone from JPL to SpaceX. We are incredibly supportive of what they do. You know, they build rockets, and we need rides for our missions. And so as they branch out into thinking about Mars exploration as well, they have JPL navigators that are helping with that. They actually just had a landing site workshop to start thinking about where they might want to land on Mars, and it was scientists and engineers from JPL that participated in that as well. So the world of space that we hope to see in 10 years is already starting to form now, if we look at the whole of robotic and human. All right, I'm off my soapbox now.
No, it was a good soapbox.
It was good. Susan.
So I don't consider it a colony on Mars till there's a Starbucks there. That's just me. You know, I think a lot of the stumbling blocks to achieving our goals in space is politics. I wish we could just take the politics out of it. One of the things that I noticed in my travels is that when the two areas that I saw the most cooperation with when I was going into places like the West Bank or hotspots around the world is that the people who are artists and the people who were scientists were the most cooperative. That's where kind of politics fell away, because they were everybody was working together to achieve this common goal of getting into space or achieving achieving some common good or putting on a show, whatever. They were doing something that was bigger than their individual self-interests. And I wish there was some way, and I don't have the answer to this, to remove a lot of the international politics from it so that these groups can kind of just get on with doing what they do best, which is achieving those end goals. And I also would like to see there being such bipolarity in American politics where, there's some sectors that consider science an option as opposed to fact. And I think that'll go a long way towards achieving some of these goals faster. And then in terms of STEM education and exciting the next generation of scientists is when you put any subject in context, like if you're going to teach a foreign language, you don't just teach words, you teach conversation, and maybe take kids to a place where they're immersed in that language. It's the same thing with science. You want to take them out into the field. You just don't want them memorizing amino acid compounds. You want them to see what their knowledge, what kind of effect their knowledge is going to have. And you also want to capture their imagination, which is where storytelling comes into play, which is where the arts come into play. And if you can fuse those two elements together, I think that's where the excitement, when you have the context, the imagination, and possibilities, that's where you can, instead of rote memorization, that's where you can, I think, excite people into maybe seeing the value of STEM careers as opposed to becoming the next reality TV star. So that's sort of that would be sort of my wish list to kind of engage the next 10 years. It's never going to happen.
Imagine.
We're
Dennis.
working on it.
Optimistic.
So a person that speaks multiple languages is a polyglot. A person that speaks 2 languages is bilingual, and a person that only speaks 1 language is an American.
Yes.
In my first week at JPL, I'll just share with you because I was pinching myself. I'm like, am I dreaming? I'm here. I can't believe it. I'm working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I used to drive by on the 210 and see, the sign, JPL, NASA, next right. And I'm like, oh. And one day I took that exit and I drove up to the guard gate. I said, oh, sorry, I got lost. I didn't get lost. I wanted to go there. That was just so cool. And they had a big sign that says, welcome to our universe. And it has the big NASA meatball, as we call it, up there. And so my first week, I'm walking up to the cafeteria. Now, my parents were both polyglots, and I'm just bilingual. But I can pick out a lot of languages. And what amazed me in my first week was all the different languages that were spoken at the laboratory. America has a very unique ability to draw the best and brightest from around the world, and JPL is precisely that. You will see a large number of foreign nationals, and to Sue's point, I've had a boss that was Israeli working for an Iranian, and vice versa, a Muslim working for a Jew working for a Muslim. When you're working in the sciences, there's this idea that we're serving a greater good, we're serving humanity. And I've been in the military. You know what we do. When you really strip down all the varnish, it's kind of an ugly reality, a necessary reality, but I really thought it was fantastic that I could go home and I could talk to my family and my friends and tell them what I do for a living and go into detail about it. So really fantastic. So I am very much a Pollyanna when it comes to NASA's mission and space exploration. So when dealing with the next 10 years and as we look forward, one, you're hearing international cooperation. Absolutely. We need the best and the brightest of humanity stepping forward to accomplish this mission, because then you've got the kid in Spain who's looking up and sees the Spanish engineer, or the kid in India who sees someone from their home country, or a little girl who sees someone that looks just like them on TV, driving a Mars rover. I mean, how cool is that? We need those sorts of inspirations. Now, as was said in the bio, I've presented either directly or indirectly to over 10,000 students. My goal is not to get a crop of NASA astronauts out of all 10,000. That's statistically impossible. I do tell the kids, especially the younger ones, that among your ranks, like the ones that are young grade school kids, do you realize that the first human being that will set foot on Mars is your age? I'm going to be golfing, okay? I'm going to be complaining about my Social Security check when, hopefully, when the first human
You're lucky.
lands on Mars, okay? If a human lands on Mars. So now I'm going to play Darth Vader here. I'm going to crap all over everything that everybody said, because it's going to boil down to two things, okay? The success of all of these lofty dreams, all the stuff that we dreamed up after watching Star Trek. If you give the human race enough time and money, we can do amazing things together. Time and money. Money's a problem. How do we pay for it? We're seeing that Social Security is running up into deficits. Medicare, how do we pay for health care? These are all very legitimate things, and I'm not taking a side on that. I want you to imagine a dollar bill. Now, I would pull a dollar out of my wallet, but I just want to inform you, I'm not only married, but I have 2 kids, so I have no money in my wallet. But imagine that dollar bill, and imagine that dollar bill's 100 pennies. Now, if that dollar is for every dollar that the US government spends, take one of those pennies and snap it into a fraction, and that's all of NASA's budget, including the International Space Station, astronauts, robotic space flight, you name it. That's it. Now, the Apollo days, and maybe Rod can correct me, but I think it was 4 cents for every dollar that we were spending to get to the moon. So we've gone from 4 cents, 4%, to less than a fraction of a percent for our entire space exploration program. We need to pick projects that give us the best bang for our buck. The other thing is that it takes a long time to plan a NASA mission, and this is where I get involved. I'm looking at the budgets and the schedules, the really not sexy stuff. I'm not turning a wrench, I'm not designing things, I'm not thinking up crazy ideas. I'm usually shooting them down with, you don't have enough time and you don't have enough money. And those are the 2 cold, cruel realities. So what these scientists do is they come up with these proposals and they pitch them to NASA. And NASA has this huge selection to pick from. And many of them are excellent, and not all of them will be funded. So they pick the ones that that produce the best science and are the most likely to succeed. And then we go forward, and some of those things can take 10 years. So the Curiosity rover, which Nagi and I both worked on, took well over 10 years before it even set foot on Mars. That's a lot of planning. 10 years of people's lives. So when you look at the video coverage of these engineers and scientists whooping and hollering and jumping all around the place, that's 1 decade of their life that they have spent on this rover. So there's some incredible passion, and I'm very, very privileged to be part of it. But I will, before I just leave you on the doom and gloom note regarding budgets and schedules and all of that stuff that nobody likes to hear about, I want to give you a few things to think about. How many of you guys in the last week have seen a NASA logo on a shirt or a backpack? Yeah, they're all over the place. It's like a fashion accessory. It's like the old Ralph Lauren polo logo, right? It's cool. The other thing is, back in the 80s, for those of you that are my age, I was a teenager back in the 80s, and we had movies like Revenge of the Nerds, where, you know, the straight A students were getting picked on and beat on, and now nerd culture is cool. When I played Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, I didn't tell anybody. No way, no. The whole football team played D&D, but we never admitted it. Now, you've got Stranger Things, Game of Thrones. D&D is cool. Being a nerd is cool. Being smart is cool, and I love that. And that gives me an incredible amount of hope, because now you have some of the role models are smart people, really smart people. So a couple of other little useless tidbits. You'll never make a dime off of this stuff, but NASA year after year has been rated the #1 government agency to work at. We haven't produced the flying car for you yet, but The Martian by Andy Weir, the movie with Matt Damon, when that movie came out, JPL Open House, and for those of you that have not been to JPL Open House, oh my gosh, you're missing out. JPL Open House had, I think, over 40,000 people in 2 days' time. Imagine Disneyland with the lines. And I took my kids there, and they said it was so packed, all they saw were bellies, butts, and backs. And we left. I said, don't worry, I'll bring you back to take your kid to work day. They had to shut down the 210 freeway. Now we do Eventbrite tickets that you can claim. 24,000 tickets go in just 2 minutes. It's insane. If you want to tour a JPL, you have to book them 6 months in advance, and they go in less than 5 minutes. They're free. All of these things are free. So the National Air and Space Museum, I believe, is the most visited museum in the world. Is that correct?
Yes.
Although
Not
attendance is
anymore.
dropping off.
Not anymore.
That's because only a third of it's open.
So.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
starting to go down. The Natural History Museum on the Mall is the #1.
Okay, but it's close.
It's still science.
Yeah, it's yeah. The top paying majors, not that people should choose these majors for money, but the top paying majors, the top 20, almost all of them are STEM. So when I go to schools and I inspire kids to study STEM, it's not so they can come work at NASA. Sure, that's a great hook, but it gets them interested, because when I take them and I run them over with the Mars rover, because that's really cool. It sounds horrible, but they love it. It's like getting a back rub. When I run them over with the Mars rover, the next time they watch the news and they hear something about NASA, they perk up. Oh, hey, yeah. You know, that's what we want. We want them studying the math. We want them studying the science. Because even if they don't go into a STEM career, they have that training in the back of their mind, that analytical, mathematical training that will help them for everything. Even if you're a stay-at-home mom, balancing a budget, avoiding shopping math is a big deal, and being able to balance your budget and paying attention to the numbers and being able to smell out a con because you can do the math. I love doing that, by the way. When people try to pull the fast one on me, and I say, let's do the math. Oh boy, I have fun with that one. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So
Martin,
this is.
can I add one
Yeah,
thing?
please. We have comments. We have comments.
Sorry, I just want to add one thing to what Dennis was saying, and I believe Rod and Ben both said this as well, that when we talk about STEM literacy, yes, you know, even if they don't go into STEM fields, obviously it'd be good if they knew how their cell phone worked and some of the day-to-day need for being science literate. The other thing that I wanted to share was a story from, on my vacation, when I have time, I speak for the U.S. State Department in some slightly more far-flung areas, and I was reminded of that when we were talking about that I'm not trying to be a NASA recruiting poster, right? In many cases, what the State Department wants is, yes, you come in under the NASA banner, but what they're really trying to say is, look, it's important for girls to get educated. It's important to, and so I'll go into messages that are broader, like, you know, do something that matters, something that you have a passion towards. And I specifically remember that when I was speaking in Jordan, that the embassy was working with the local government and mosque to try to develop. They just started a very inspirational. For me, I found it very inspiring to hear what they were doing in the area of countering violent extremism, and the way they were working, the way the embassy and the foreign service officers were working with the local imams to try to give the youth in that area some feeling like they had options. And I was so moved by what I was hearing when they were describing these countering violent extremism programs that I said, and I remember being quite surprised because I said, what can I do? And they said, NASA's, and in my case, the stories I was telling, they said, you're already doing it. When you talk about stories of exploration, about doing jobs that matter, about doing something with their lives that matter, and they can see themselves as part of that, then what they said is you are giving these kids an alternative view of the future. What kind of, not just in far-flung areas, but here, you know, locally as well, in our country as well, when kids need to see the different possibilities for their futures. And as was said, if you're thinking about being the next reality star, that when you, or seeing paths that say, I'm going to be a sports, you know, I can either be in sports, or I can be a celebrity, or I can be a singer or an actor, and that's the paths they see. That even when you're talking about NASA, it's not all about come work at JPL, come work for NASA, come work for any space agency in the world. It's about see that your future matters, right? See that we need you, whatever you choose to go into. And that is part of the broader conversation that I think STEM literacy, as Ben was saying, gives, is just your future matters and we need you, even if you choose to go into something that isn't STEM or isn't working for the space program. And for me, that was kind of brought home by that moment in Jordan where they said just having these kids see a hopeful view of the future is countering violent extremism.
It's true, but
So-
the Hashemite kingdom and King Hussein is unique in the Middle East. Unique. Even UAE and Dubai cannot match.
So if I may, we can't count on NASA to carry this ball alone. They're the most respected brand in the world, ahead of Nike and Coca-Cola, have been for a long time, if you do those kind of studies. They do a great job, but their charter is very limited when it comes to education outreach, and there's always somebody, whether it's in the administration or in Congress, trying to cut their education and outreach budget every year. They do that better than everybody, yeah, but there's always a pair of scissors hovering over that. And let's just reinforce, 0.5% of the federal budget and doing 10 times as much in terms of both planetary and certainly things like observing climate change than they were in the 1960s. So these graph plots are moving in the wrong direction for them to become more effective in this area. By the way, there's a big swath of Americans, something north of 30%, that think that NASA's budget is about 25% of the federal budget. We have a perception issue here. So what do? Well, people like Susan and I and others write about this stuff all the time. We are NASA boosters and SpaceX boosters and Blue Origin boosters. We're occasionally critical, but in general, we're very supportive of these companies. So it's natural to look to them and say, help us solve this problem. So one thing that SpaceX is doing, we constantly think, okay, SpaceX, put your money where your mouth is and help us out here. And they kind of drag their feet sometimes. It doesn't happen right away. But when somebody thinks, hey, we need to bore tunnels under Los Angeles, Elon does it. When somebody thinks, gee, why doesn't somebody sell flamethrowers in Amazon? Elon does it, for better or worse. What he's also done recently is open a school, interestingly called Ad Astra. It was before the movie came out, for obvious reasons. And they have 50 kids in there who are on site at the SpaceX plant going to a school that's very alternative in nature. It's kind of modeled after a system like UC Santa Cruz. No grades are issued, narrative evaluation system, all that. Teaching technology and science and the arts, but really emphasizing on some of these hard skills that public school struggles with because it's private and they can. And I would love to see that expand because I think that's really putting your money where your mouth is. And of course, I'd like to see them put a little more effort in public relations because, you know, if getting news out of SpaceX up until a few years ago was kind of like getting news from the Soviet Union, and getting news out of Blue Origin was like getting news out of North Korea, but it's getting better. So we need them to help us spread the word, and we need you to encourage them to do that as well.
Susan, I want your view on this STEM versus the arts, or STEM and the arts in education.
You just pulled the pin out of the hand grenade.
No, I'm sorry. Go.
You go, Susan.
there,
You're talking about
because-
STEM versus arts, or how each can harness
Alongside
each?
the arts. Well, I mean, you know, when I of course sympathize. I was a math teacher amongst many careers, so I sympathize when I hear people talking about, you know, STEM ed. It's great stuff. Got to do it. All the employment of the future is yada yada. That is until AI says to all the coders who are not 10x coders, you're out of work.
But are you saying STEM versus the arts?
With or versus?
Or
I'm
with-
interested in
okay.
your view about that. So, I mean, in terms of what is the proper balance now for kids, for K-12 kids, in this world and in the world that we're hoping to see evolve between the two?
Well, when I was growing up in the 80s, well, I grew up earlier than that, but when I was like in the Jurassic era, I'll just put it out there.
Pleistocene.
When dinosaurs walked the earth.
10,000 years ago.
Sciences and arts were far apart.
Yeah.
And these were my two strengths. And I was constantly like running back and forth between camps because I was equally right brain, left brain, and I would become imbalanced if I only did one thing. And I've seen over my lifetime these two camps merge closer and closer together to wonderful effects. So you're seeing places like JPL engage Art Center and some of the animators to illustrate their scientific concepts, and you're seeing in the way that they engage the public, especially JPL. There's a woman at JPL named Veronica McGregor who came up with the idea to do anthropomorphized Twitter feeds for the rovers, and people, and she also developed what became the NASA socials, which are when they engage citizen scientists or people who are influencers to come, and they treat them just like journalists, and then they go out and go forth and tweet, and they'll talk to their followers all about NASA stuff, and so that's the whole idea of harnessing people who are just really enthusiastic. But all of that is kind of artistic creativity, and you're using it in a way to promote and engage people in science. I think there are even artists in residence at certain NASA facilities.
We have one at JPL.
Do
We
you?
have multiple.
Oh, okay. And this goes back to what I was saying before about that a scientific pursuit starts first with imagination and creativity. You know, how do we go from X to Y? What can we invent that doesn't exist yet so that we can do that? And you have to open both channels. I think the arts helps you open that imagination that can then spark give impetus for the science to then follow and make that imagination a reality. So they're not separate, and I think people are starting to realize that. And I think the technology has come to a point where you can use, zeros and ones to actually turn into a visual, so people can go, oh, I see what you're saying.
If I may piggyback on that, I view a lot of resumes. I deal with a lot of the people side of NASA, and this whole idea of right or left brain is, to me, a false narrative. When I have looked at the bios and the profiles of some of these amazing engineers and scientists that I have the privilege to work with, you will find that they are incredible artists alongside being incredible engineers and scientists. When Nagi and I did a Women in STEM event, we had certain questions that all of the speakers had to address. And of the 18 women that spoke, almost all of them had some kind of artistic background, especially in music. Maybe it's all those quarter notes that they have to add up or something. But it's huge. There's a large number of JPL engineers that are woodworkers. I design and build my own furniture, and there's a lot of other people that do that. And I have a theory behind that, and that is when you work at JPL or NASA and you're working on a Mars rover, you're one small part of a very big team. There's no one person. Hollywood loves to show that one guy comes in and saves the day. It doesn't work that way in real life. You've got a team of people working together. But when you go home, there's just some satisfaction of designing something and building something. And so a lot of these folks at JPL have outside artistic pursuits that they follow. And you can't separate one from the other. So I think that they call it STEM, but also STEAM, where you add the A for art.
There's a huge JPL contingency at Burning Man every year, and
Tell us about that. You mentioned it before.
Yeah, I actually did a story on this whole group of people. A lot of them were from STEM backgrounds or JPL, whatever, and they call themselves the Desert Wizards of Mars, and they recreated the Mars rover, Curiosity, and they all dress up in these orange jumpsuits or the blue jumpsuits, and they go out and they act like astronauts on this Mars rover, but the Burning Man, the fly at Burning Man looks like Mars, so and so they kind of play with it, but in doing so, people will come up and say, what is this? And then they'll give science lectures there. There's a guy who brings a mobile observatory up there, and they have a whole bunch of lectures there, and they're up all night looking at the stars. So there are places where you wouldn't think would attract science people that are attracting a lot of science people. And then people are out there and stumble upon the observatory, and maybe then go look at Saturn and then get excited and bring that back home.
Your point before about art
I
and
think
science.
Well, yeah, sorry. That's okay. Sounds all really good. But, and I agree that there's an inherent connection between these two things, but it rubs me the wrong way when it becomes a art-science dichotomy. And I think that's what STEAM totally codifies. So as much as, and I agree, I was one of those kids that was always kind of jumping between art and science and stuff, and I have a theater company here in town, but I also lead a science organization. So, but I think that's inherent to people who are creative and want to do stuff, and there is an inherent creativity in science or STEM that doesn't need to be talked about in a way that's separate from the creativity in art. So my problem with STEAM is that when you put the A in there, I hear it, people say, and you talk about that's where the imagination, sits or something. The people who've been dreaming up how to engineer things to go to Mars or wherever are scientists using their imagination to dream these things up. People who are imagining stories for books we label them as artists, but they're using their creativity to do this other thing. It's all the same, but as soon as you put that A in STEM, you separate the two. And I hear all the time in school districts that, we're going to do art so that it can be creative, and then we're going to do science too. That perpetuates that
False
chasm
dichotomy.
that was being bridged for a while, and now it's starting to kind of come apart. I do think that one thing that's improved a lot is that there's a lot more permission now for science people or art people to say that they're playing both sandboxes, or that it's all the same sandbox, but they can say that they're the same. But yeah, so going back to your original question though about this is like, what do we need to do? I think it's not so much about those narratives, but it's about, we don't fund arts education or even science education very much in a lot of schools, right? So you're not getting exposure to any of this stuff for the most part. So you can't even make a choice, or an informed choice. That to me you need to have both, because you need to have school, which includes arts education, physical education, like all that kind of stuff.
Well, arguably. I mean, some people, I am one, I'm not convinced that we do need school. You need school for socialization.
Well, I don't mean school in the sort of capital S, but you need a full breadth of subject matter to be
Yes.
able to, yeah, and you need some.
And some of us are old enough, most of you not, to remember C.P. Snow, writing a famous essay 50, 60 years ago about the two worlds, these utterly dichotomous worlds of arts and science, and how will they ever be bridged? And I think you're quite right that that we all of you in your lives, every single one of you, because you're communicators and because you're visionary, actually integrate the two in your work, in your day-to-day work. Dennis in management, Susan in publishing, Negin in running projects, and you in running a science center, and Rod in flogging his words that help people vision the future.
While you guys
Nikki,
are
did you want to say
texting,
something?
No, I'm
Oh,
good.
okay.
while you guys are texting on your phones, go ahead and Google search JPL pumpkin carving contest.
Yeah.
And that will give you some idea of the creativity. Don't tell me there's not an artistic streak in these engineers. It is incredible. You will never carve another crappy pumpkin again. It will give you a complex for your next Halloween, but it's really entertaining.
But I do want
Pumpkins
I
are
want to talk
nice.
a little bit about resources though, like in the sense of like funding these kind of things. So the art 20 years ago, 25 years ago maybe now, there was a lot of funding going to arts organizations in the United States. I used to work for the National Science Foundation. They were giving money, they weren't giving money, but other organizations in the feds were giving money to arts organizations. About 10, 15 years ago, that funding flipped, and now STEM is overwhelmingly getting a lot of funding, and arts education is not. In the arts days, a lot of the science departments, I used to work at another museum in Chicago, we were going to arts organizations trying to do partnerships because we knew that's where the funding was. And the arts people were like, no, we do arts, we don't do science. Then when everything flipped, we found a lot of the arts people approaching us to try to get in on the same sort of gravy train that's out there. So I feel like the narratives for both have been like, well, STEM is now a highway to employment, because that makes a lot of sense to be able to get funds. And the arts have developed this narrative that they're the originators of all the ideas for STEM, so now you should fund us too. But none of those things are inherently true. They're just the ways that we've had to tell the story to be able to get the money.
And I'm sorry, we've left only 5 minutes, but there's another thing coming up, and you can stay in space with us. But your questions, please. Anybody have any queries, sir?
I have a question more so and a comment. I think it's really cool that you guys do the hackathon in South Central and West LA areas where the exposure is not high for science and technology, right? But I also see a huge rate of funding being funded at where Crenshaw High School changed their name to Crenshaw Science and Technology. Westchester's done that as well. But what happens is the students lose the aptitude of science and technology because they don't have the infrastructure to understand the curriculum that's being forced upon them. So what do you guys think about how the funding is being massively funded for STEM, but the infrastructure is not prepared? And so I don't see like any preschools being STEM approved, but I'm seeing high schools being STEM approved. So how are we pipelining that?
I love an idea
I-
of a STEM preschool, man. That's seriously.
I can try to answer
it's
that
called
one
Montessori.
quickly, because I used to teach myself, and I think somebody else here also admitted to being a teacher. But one of the challenges that we're facing right now is the unequal access to education. So when you look at statistics and you see you can put 1 foot in boiling water, another foot in freezing water, but the temperature on average is just fine, right? And they say that the average American student is falling behind compared to Korea and compared to Singapore, et cetera, et cetera. Those statistics are actually misleading. If you were to take access to education into account in all these various countries. American students are doing quite well. What happens is that in certain neighborhoods, you find kids that don't have that equal access to education, and they drag the number down. Now, this is not sad from a number standpoint, this is sad from a human capital standpoint. And so there have been schools that I've reached out to where I've tried, and some of my friends have tried, to make a conscious effort to reach out to schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And you sometimes get a really sad answer, and that is, I want to come and do a presentation to your student body. I want to bring a Mars rover. I want to bring some engineers and scientists to come and talk about the cool stuff we do right down the street. And you get a lot of, soft shoe, and it's like, what's going on? What happens is the schools their backs are against the wall because they're being judged by test scores. And that's what it is. So if I go and talk to their students for a day, that's a day they don't have to prep for a test.
Absolutely.
And I don't know what the answer is. I don't want to be critical because I am not a principal, and I understand the pressures that they're under. The thing that makes me sad is that the kids are the ones paying the price. So.
And their parents, in large part, are so overburdened with distractions, really cosmic
We're
distractions.
trying to afford living in Los Angeles.
Financial and, the criminal justice system and all the racist stuff that falls on people's heads. That there's, little of a, organized constituency to call out for what we all know is what's needed. It's real. I mean, we're going to work on this. We're going to solve this thing. We're going to.
We're close to you. We'll work with you.
Who's got a question?
I'm a teaching artist, so I'm working a lot with K through 8th grade students. And what I'm noticing is, at least in my understanding, is California is transitioning, as it always wants to do, to more arts and emotional learning, physical emotional learning education, which is fantastic. There's the VAPA standards.
Mm-hmm.
There are standards for science and math and English, but there's never been an official one for arts. That's coming on board now, which is great because that means arts now has a standard where kids in every grade, pre-K through 12, can learn things about, dance and music, and which all feeds into science and math and accounting, which I would never think a numbers person has any kind of creativity, but there's so much creativity. I think
Be careful there. Creative accounting.
Oh, man.
Those are two words we don't like to use together.
Just look into, just Google number theory.
I might put a little dash on my 7. But what I'm saying is, as a teaching artist, there are programs that are being funded like PS Arts and Inner City Arts that are working with underserved schools. And also schools are trying to transition away from testing only. But I also learned to get into a school to bring in a program is difficult. You've got administrators and parents that you need to start to get excited about. That's where I'm learning, that's where you start there.
That's right.
And you also start with the other programs that are already existing and are already working with schools. That's the way you get in. So that's how I see this working, is working with these programs that have started up.
Schools are a tough ecology to plug into. They really are.
I think we really try to support things that are beyond school and outside of school. I mean, the internet's flooded with everything from soup to nuts and emphasis on the nuts, and we know that. But there's a lot of people doing good work in both venues like YouTube and podcasts and so forth. And I'm shocked. I've got a podcast up with KFI, the local radio station. And when I start getting demographic reports, I'm shocked at how many people that are young that are listening to that, because I'm not programming for them. I just naturally think like an old guy, right? And I try to get down to like 30 or 35, but I'm finding there's a lot of teenagers listening to it. So there is a curiosity and a real hunger out there. The problem is getting the right message in front of them. When I say right message, I mean something that's somewhat authoritative and factual and isn't talking about we never went to the moon because there's nothing to push against for a rocket in space, and you hit this stuff all the time. So that's something I think we can all support.
How do they do that? Any
Just
other?
throw rocks
One
out
more
the
minute.
back.
Sir.
I work with an educational nonprofit that trains teachers and supports their students in the creation of video, digital stories, short narratives that relate to whatever it is that they're teaching across curriculum. Not to create more professional filmmakers, but as a matter
We speak too much to minds and not enough to hearts.
Yes.
And NASA's been very guilty of that for a long time. Not a fault of their own, it's just, I think, the natural outcome of that system. JPL less than other NASA field centers. I hate to keep boosting you guys, but it's true. They really revolutionized online content when Pathfinder landed back in 1997. The world suddenly saw a joyous Rob Manning, who was the chief engineer on the thing with his fist up in the air, and JPL hasn't been the same since, and they've led in that area ever since. But they learned how to speak to people's emotions and how to tell a good story. And these are great stories. I've been telling the Apollo story ever since I was 12, and there's still good money in it. I get hired to go talk about this all the time. You'd think people would be tired of it by now. But if you put it out there like an adventure tale, they're right there. And that's something JPL does brilliantly with projects like Curiosity, which has its own account. And it should be called Snarky Rover or something, I think, because it actually is very fun the way they do it, but it attracts a huge following.
And to that point, too, if we look at entertainment, and this is, I'm doing a plug for the next panel, too, once again, getting back to the demographics of who's at JPL, if you ask them, what inspired you as a kid, and overwhelmingly, you'll hear Star Trek, 2001 Space Odyssey. Star Wars. Where's my lightsaber? Where's my flying car? All of that kind of stuff. And if you look at today, look at Andy Weir's movie The Martian. And JPL gets tapped a lot because we're right down the street from Hollywood, and they tap us a lot to be technical advisors. And technical advisors have a tough job because they're going to get razzed back at work. It's like, oh my gosh, winds don't blow that hard on Mars. Sorry, dude. And they'll have signs hanging outside their offices and making fun of them. But we understand. But the movie The Martian was very close scientifically, and there's a beautifully told story and a great example that you don't have to veer too far off of the science to have great storytelling.
That's actually a trend in science fiction over the last 20 years. You're as the general public is becoming more tech savvy, they're kind of demanding more accurate science in their science fiction.
And the flip side of that is, the displays in 2001 inspired display designs down the road. The completely fantastic ridiculousness of, Tom, what's his name, Cruise, with the flipping of the screens and what those screens encompassed in.
Was that Minority Report?
Yeah.
Right. That has impacted design.
Sure.
That was based on John Underkoffler, who was a graduate student at MIT Media Lab.
Yep.
Had that as his thesis.
Right.
They found out about Alex McDowell, who was the production designer for that, found out about it, met with him. They had a whole meeting with Spielberg, and they based that machine on his thesis.
But see, that stuff,
then there was so much interest, it was such an iconic scene, that there started to become businesses interested in funding that for real.
Right.
And now it's a company, and it's called Oblong.
There it is. So this happens again and again. It's
downtown. It's here. It's down LA.
Systole, diastole. It's the way the heart beats. You bring it in and you blow it out. And the arts are part of it, and STEM is part of it. And on that note, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to do vision stuff. Total out there media. And thank the panel.
Thank you.
I want everybody's cards. You're also
Come back at 1 o'clock.